I'm here today as a parent and a senator, and along with my colleagues and so many of the advocates from around the country, we are determined to stop a situation in which video games with pornographic and violent content are being peddled to our children. Today I'm announcing, along with my colleagues, Senator Lieberman and Bai, the Family Entertainment Protection Act.
This speech by US Senator Hillary Clinton is prompted by the scandal surrounding the Grand Theft Auto video game. The entire history of the GTA series is accompanied by various scandals, accusations, and lawsuits. But on the other hand, it really became a great phenomenon of the game industry with its unique sharp social satire of the modern world, sometimes crossing the line or not. In this episode, I'm going to tell the story of the GTA series. Hi there and welcome to the Released podcast. Today technology surrounds us everywhere and we can't even imagine our lives without them. But every technology started as a bold idea in someone's head. In this podcast, we talk about the technologies that have changed our lives and the people who invented them. My name is Rival. Hi. The story of the game begins in the small town of Dundee in Scotland. It is a harbour sea town. The textile industry has been actively developing in it for a long time. Imagine a huge number of workers, factories, railroad, port. Somewhat even reminds me of the atmosphere of some of the games that we will discuss today. But in the early 20th century, the textile industry began to decline. Many workers lost their jobs, but at the same time the city's economy started to transform. First, the technology company NCR came to town, and then the Timex company. And it is this Timex factory in Dundee in 1983 started producing the first ZX Spectrum home computers, which became very popular. The company even allowed its employees to buy subsidized ZX Spectrums and paid for programming courses at the local Kingsway Technical College. This all highly increased the interest in computers in the city. Okay, what was so special about these computers? Remember, Marcin Nowinski, the founder of CD Projekt from the second episode of the podcast, he also had a Spectrum. This computer is considered as one of the most influential computers ever made. It is also one of the best-selling British computers ever, with over 5 million units sold. It was small, simple, and most importantly, inexpensive with as few components as possible. The user could connect it to their TV rather than a specialized monitor. And it loaded programs and games from audio tapes. Yes, audio tapes, you heard it right. I don't think many of us remember those days. And there are still even nowadays contests for writing games and programs for the Spectrums. The local college also hosted the Kingsway Amateur Computer Club meetings. Participants brought their own computers, most often Spectrums. Some people played games in the club, some just exchanged them with each other, and some were interested in creating them. That is where David Jones, Mike Daly, Steve Hammond, and Russell Kay met. They later grew into a huge studio, but first things first. At that time, they were experimenting with simple games, for example Freak Out and Zone Trooper for Spectrum and other computers. At some point, David Jones began developing a Menace game for another popular computer, Amiga. This game was a shooter in which a player controlled a spaceship and had to fight alien enemies. But you can't just create a game, you need to find a publisher. Because you simply can't just go to each retail store in your city and offer them your game. You need a company that has contacts and access to a network of such retail stores. This company will sell it, promote it, you as a creator get a certain fee, and other people do the sales. So to find such a partner, David went to the Personal Computer World Show trade event and met with several publishers. Eventually he managed to sign a deal with Psygnosis Game Studio to publish the game. Moreover, the contract included the release of not only this game but 5 additional ones. By the way, you may remember this Psygnosis Studio from the very first episode about Sony and how it influenced the release of PlayStation. But at the time we are discussing, Psygnosis is also a young company, launched 3 years ago. After the release of this game, David realized that the game development can be not just a hobby but also make some money. That is when he founded the game studio DMA Design in 1988. He dropped out of university, started the sequel to Menace Blood Money, and began hiring his friends to join the studio. They rented an office. It was a small, pink, 2-story building, with a children's clothing store on the first floor and a young, ambitious game studio on the second one. The studio was growing, hiring new staff. They were also working on porting game for Psygnosis. The approach was that porting brought in money which they used to develop new projects. One day Mike Daly decided to experiment with how small the characters could be made, but so that you could distinguish their movements and their animations. He spent his lunch break making a prototype and showing it to his colleagues. Everyone laughed at these funny little people, but then someone noticed that it could be made into a game. After 9 months of development, the game Lemmings was released and became the studio's first hit. It was such a puzzle. There were a lot of these little creatures moving across the screen, and they only went forward even if there was a cliff or some other dangers ahead. But the player could give different tasks to the lemmings, like digging or turning other lemmings around. Actually, the goal of the game was to get a certain percentage of lemmings from that entrance to the exit of the level. The game was released in 1991. On the first day, 55,000 copies of the game were sold, and 20 million copies were sold throughout its lifetime. An outstanding result for the young studio. I wonder what was so appealing about this game. Probably the unusual concept, interesting and varied levels, and of course the fact that these creatures turn out to be very cute. After that, DMA Design rented a bigger office and hired more employees. Lemmings ports to other computers came out, followed by several sequels. And another important consequence was that the studio was noticed by the market giant Nintendo company. DMA Design started several projects for the Super Nintendo and the future console Nintendo 64, but none of them went into production for various reasons. But the partnership with Nintendo allowed the team to hire even more people and rent an even bigger office. Well, in early 90s, the DMA Design was actively growing and developing different games in parallel. So in 1995, it already employed 130 employees. Yeah, it's not that little studio above a children's clothing store anymore. Around this time, Mike Daly was experimenting with ways to render 3D buildings from a top-down perspective. Something like what you see when you open a map of your city in a browser or on a smartphone. He made a demo where a player controlled a dinosaur that walked around and destroyed the city. Then he replaced the dinosaur with cars and let the user race around the city. And the next thing, this concept turned into a game that should have been called Race and Chase. The idea was that the player is a policeman, pursuing criminals in a very lively city with many other cars and pedestrians. The view was from above, as if from a police helicopter.
That's the list, Shelby 13 Central. 5 George K. 5 George K. 5 George K. 496 Broadway between Broome and Spring.
In 1993, Sony bought the previous publisher Psygnosis Studio, so DMA Design had to find a new one. Now, let's, like in the game, switch to another characters in our story for a while and talk about them. I mean Sam Houser and his little brother Dan. They played a key role in the development of the GTA series and the entire studio. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. They were born in London, and from childhood they were into crime movies, video games, and wanted to be rock musicians. You could say they were such rebels. Here is how David Kushner, author of a book on the history of GTA, describes Sam during his high school years. They looked neat and orderly, the dark blazers with the badges, the crisp white button-down shirts and dark ties, the charcoal pants and dark socks, the black leather dress shoes. All of the boys identical, almost, except the one seen around school with the Doc Marten boots poking out from under his slacks, Sam. Sam Hauser, the older brother, got a job at Bertelsmann Music Group, or BMG, in 1990. He directed in-house music videos for bands such as Take That and the Spice Girls. A little later, BMG opened a new division to work with video games, BMG Interactive, since they thought it was a promising market. Sam went there and then became head of development, and a bit more later, his brother joined him on a job at BMG. It was the Hauser brothers who became interested in the game created by the DMA design, that game where you chase criminals in the city center. They decided to sign a contract to publish it, and the game's development has begun. After a lot of work was done and the game was shown to the focus group, it turned out to be completely boring and uninteresting. Imagine you are a policeman chasing a gangster. You have to stop at every traffic light, carefully avoid pedestrians. Well, it's boring. By the way, when I played GTA as a kid, my grandfather never understood why I don't want to drive by the rules or why I ignore traffic lights. And then the developers decided to flip the game and make the main character a criminal, running away from the chase, and also change the name to Grand Theft Auto.
Now, all the people in here are working on what DMA hopes will be its new blockbuster. It's a game called Grand Theft Auto. It's got to be finished by the end of June, so they're involved in some pretty hard work in here. It's all about a car chase through the streets of a fictional, probably American city. Here are some of the maps they've been working on. And Dave here is one of the...
You go. Good shot, kid. You go.
No one at the time thought that the game would become very successful. They even wanted to shut it down a few times. But the game was released in 1997. The player could steal other people's cars, sell them, attack and kill people around. And for all offenses, the player was given money. The goal was to earn $1 million and then the next city would open. There were 3 cities in the game: Liberty City, similar to New York, Vice City to Miami, and San Andreas to San Francisco. Many people think that the entire GTA series was made in the USA, but as you can see, it all comes from Scotland. There were missions in the game too, but they weren't connected to any story. Just go there, steal a car, and that sort of thing. But most of the time the players entertained themselves. The big open city was very exciting. One could find a tank somewhere in an alley and wreak havoc on the road, or just driving around town in the car listening to the radio. Speaking of radio, the game was originally planned to be released on floppy disks, but they decided to cancel that and release the game on CD. But there was nothing to fill this increased volume, and buyers expected that since they were paying for CD, the cutting-edge technology of the time, they should get something worthwhile for their money. So developers decided to try to add a few different radio stations and music of different genres, so that the player in the car could choose which station to listen to. And since then, radio has become one of the main things in GTA. There were some problems in the game, such as the top-down view. It was a technical limitation to make a large city without multiple loading screens. You could just limit the view, then the less computer resources would be spent to draw that. Another drawback was that the lack of a map and the ability to save the game. The promotion of the game wasn't ordinary either. BMG Interactive hired publicist Max Clifford to tell about the violence of the game, to make a scandal around it before the game is even released. Well, negative commercials are also commercials. Anyway, many people were curious about the future game. The game was released in November 1997 for PC and soon after for PlayStation. The game received mixed reviews, with many not liking the controls and two-dimensional look, but it still became financially successful. People like the freedom of action, the fun the game provides, praise the radio. It managed to sell 500,000 copies pretty quickly. After that came two expansions about London, the only non-fictional city in the series, and began the development of the second part. The second part changed the setting, with the action now taking place in the Anywhere City in 2013. That is the not too distant future. The atmosphere of the game changed. It became darker, reduced brightness, added lighting effects. The game looked much better. The map was added, the ability to save, a variety of new weapons. Revoke the physics of cars, the intelligence of the citizens. They now, for example, could also steal cars. The gameplay has little changed. The player now did the tasks of various gangs. Also, there was a possibility to steal a taxi and earn money by driving passengers around. All in all, it looked like a fix for the mistakes of the first part. Nothing major, but it got a little better in all aspects. They even made a short movie to promote the game, which was about the main character.
In the city, respect is everything.
It is interesting how the development was going on. Since the development group was not large, a lot depended on everyone. Team brainstorming sessions and discussions were constantly taking place. In many ways, developers made the game just as they themselves would have fun playing it. The bigger studio gets, the less and less it will depend on the individual, the less area they will be responsible for. The game was released in 1999 and was received rather tepidly. There were a lot of criticism of the graphics. Still left the top-down view looking outdated against other 3D games. Players also didn't like the lack of the big new things and any innovations. Basically, it became clear that just adding new missions and changing the visuals, as was the case with the Lemmings, would no longer work. Radical changes were needed. At the same time, through a series of acquisitions and mergers, publisher Take-Two Interactive acquired BMG Interactive and DMA Design. So the new Rockstar Games studio was created, and DMA Design became Rockstar North. Some even say this is how the Hauser brothers realized their childhood dream of becoming rock stars. Who knows? It was also around this time that DMA Design studio creator David Jones left the company. In year 2000, the team moved to Edinburgh and began development of the third part. At that time, the PlayStation 2 with more powerful hardware was released, and given the feedback from the previous part, it was decided to make a full three-dimensional game this time. The development took about 2 years. Eventually, it was released in October 2001 for PlayStation and later ported to PC. The game certainly amazed everyone and became the most sold game of 2001. So, what was it that Rockstar changed? As I said, first of all the game became 3D, and secondly the camera now looked from behind the character rather than from above. The location was Liberty City, an analog of New York, and thanks to the changed camera, the player could now see various details of the city: store signs, billboards, posters, various people. Overall, the whole picture and the city was lively thanks to a large number of cars on the roads, people, airplanes in the sky, dynamic change of weather, time of day. People on the streets didn't just go back and forth, they argued, had fights, occasionally got into shootouts with the police, stole a player's car. As a result, the city felt very realistic. The other change is that the game has a story for the first time. Yes, it was quite simple, about the main character Claude's rise in the criminal world, with betrayals, revenge, and ambiguous but interesting characters. Of course, it was still common for players to entertain themselves by inventing various things, and certainly the game offered a lot of possibilities. The level of freedom was really high. Even the vertical space of the city was cleverly designed. For example, the player enters a back alley. There is a staircase that leads to the roof of a building. The player climbs it, and there lies a sniper's rifle. Maybe it doesn't sound so cool now, but at the time such details and elaboration were something new. Most importantly, the game became entertaining. It gave players the opportunity to feel themselves in the center of a criminal action movie, an unforgettable experience. Rockstar even called Hollywood stars to voice the characters. Remember the Hauser brothers' interest in crime movies when they were kids? Apparently that played a big part in it too. Sam Hauser said that GTA 3 was inspired by the movie Goodfellas and the open world of the Legend of Zelda game. We will talk more about that game later this season. From a technical perspective, GTA 3 started using the RenderWare engine. It, for example, allowed to show objects that are far away from the player with much less detail, which reduced the amount of resources consumed, so it was possible to make an open city world without additional loading screens. The success of the game was phenomenal. It sold 6 million copies in its first year and won many awards including Game of the Year. The game had a huge impact on the whole gaming industry, therefore the sequels were not long in coming. After the third part, Vice City and San Andreas were released. The first one takes place in a city similar to Miami of the 80s and was inspired by the movie Scarface. The second takes place in the 90s on the West Coast and shows gang wars, drug problems and scandals with the police. I know that for many, these are the favorites, in which a large number of hours was spent, but so as not to make the episode too long, I will focus on them rather briefly. Vice City was ready in a year. It was optimized the engine, so the picture became even better. Improved physics, added new vehicles, began to use more actively various indoor spaces, such as a club with a dance floor, a mansion. The plot became more interesting, the atmosphere is more cinematic, and of course added missions with radio-controlled toys. I never got through the mission with the helicopter. Neither did my classmates, whom I called to help me with it. In the end, it wasn't something completely new, but an improvement on everything that already existed. Another 2 years later, San Andreas came out. The area was significantly expanded, and now it was already 3 completely different cities and their neighborhoods. There were many new little mechanics. For example, the player could improve various skills, buy clothes, change hairstyle, buy food in various eateries, go on dates with girls. The latter, by the way, was associated with one of the scandals, because players were able to find how to enable initially inaccessible content in the game. And then it became possible to have sex with girls after these dates. And there were even more additional activities, from working in the quarry to playing in the sweepstakes. Also, fans have been making their own mods for the game. They even managed to add multiplayer to the game, and there are still people who spend time there. Each community has its own rules, its own scenarios. Somewhere there are just races, somewhere there are survival matches, and somewhere the player lives a whole life, starting with no money and slowly rising up by completing various missions. Next in line was the Part 4. This game begins a new era in the GTA series. There are 3 in total: 2D, 3D and HD. At the same time, there was a new generation change of consoles. The PlayStation 3 was released. For various reasons, including to make the world even more realistic, to utilize all the possibility of the updated console, it was decided to develop its own engine, Rockstar Advanced Game Engine, or RAGE. For example, character animations were no longer scripted in advance by the developers, but were now generated during the game. This made situations unique. People around were not robots with memorized movements, but reacted differently every time. After 4 years in development, the game was released and felt like a huge step forward. It was Liberty City again, but a different one, with a huge amount of details, with places taken from the real New York, like Times Square or the State of Liberty. If you look from today, you can't even say that the game came out more than 15 years ago. The graphics can compete with many modern games. The city districts differed from each other. Each one had its own cars and people, not all of whom spoke English. Even the traffic was different in every district. For this purpose, Rockstar employees in New York recorded traffic in various parts of the city at different times of the day, so that the obtained statistics could be later transferred to the game. Some even referred to the city as a separate acting character. But the city was unfriendly, with muted colors, constant fog and rain. Sad people live in their small, dirty, untidy grey apartments. And the huge city overhangs them, crushing them with its weight. And the story suited such a city, dark, dramatic, thought-provoking. The main character was an immigrant from Eastern Europe, a former soldier who is running from his past life. For the first time, the game forces the player to make difficult moral choices. All in all, this atmosphere wasn't enjoyed by everyone. Slow narrative, moody characters, complex themes. But the game still became a huge success, selling over 6 million copies of the game in the first week. 2 mods additionally were released and the development of the Part 5 began. The 5th part was published in September 2013, and once again exceeded all players' expectations. The action is again set in the city of San Andreas and its surroundings. But again the city has been completely redesigned. First, the atmosphere in the game is back to being sunny and light. Imagine a sun-drenched city, high blue sky, palm trees, beach, people in swimsuits, beautiful mansions with swimming pools, and the sunsets are amazing. Yes, the changes are visible. And the tone of the game, instead of serious, again became light and mocking. Secondly, the scale was remarkable. The map was simply huge. I won't tell you how many different details and activities there were. You just can't count. I have often heard stories how people after work just go to the game and drive a car around the map, doing nothing but just enjoying the views, the city, the nature. It reminds me of how people could drive around their real city while watching nature. The boundaries between the real world and the virtual one are blurred a bit here. For the first time, the player controlled 3 characters. Many missions led to character interactions. For example, one pilots a helicopter. The second rappels from it to break into an office through a window. And the third watches with a sniper rifle to provide support. This made the game highly dynamic. As soon as one character started a boring episode of waiting for something to happen, the player would switch to another character and get right back into the action. But even outside of missions, the player could switch between characters. When switching, we caught them not just standing on the street, but often in the process of some activity. It seems that they were living their virtual lives even when the player was not looking at them. The game had a budget of $270 million, more than many blockbusters. But the game also had a huge sales. It is the second best-selling game in the world. Also, multiplayer with regular updates was released for the 5th part. Now players could perform various missions, rob banks together with friends, compete with other users, which give even more fun. And multiplayer became one of the factors of the game's crazy popularity. In December 2023, the trailer for the next part came out, and it gained 93 million views in the first day. Yeah, everyone is wondering what Rockstar has in store for the next part. GTA has come a long way in that time. The game has influenced the way open world looks like in games today, and the whole industry in general. And I see it as a story about how constantly working on your project, continuously improving it, coming up with something new rather than following trends and repeating yourself, brings results and pays off. And as for violence in games and the scandals associated with it, modern scientific researchers show no link between playing violent computer games and aggression in real life. And even on the contrary, there are some arguments that show a decrease in violent crime after the release of popular violent games. This was the Released podcast, in its first season about video games. Thank you so much for listening, it means a lot to me, and as always, I will be very grateful if you tell your friends about it. Thank you, and see you in the next one.